shine, this little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine, this little light of mine. I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
How many of you remember them? Oh, you're giggling. Yes. For those of you who may not remember, there was a sitcom. I don't remember if it was the 60s or the 70s because they all kind of blend together in my world. It was called The Odd Couple. And they were the odd couple because they were such opposites of each other. Felix was fastidious, and Felix was obsessive compulsive, and Oscar was just kind of a pig. A couple years ago, Silverton High School did this set of plays, and they did the male version and they did the female version. Any guess which role my daughter scored? Am I in trouble now? The Odd Couple. Well, today, and they're odd because they are so opposite. And today, we really get to talk about another odd couple. And they're odd because they are so opposite of each other. And that is Peter and Paul. Two incredible men in our early church history. And we're going to talk about each one of them today. But as we do so, please understand that these men couldn't be any more opposite, probably, than Felix and Oscar. So we start with Peter. Peter is the fisherman. There he is, and we're just going to keep right on rolling to the next one. Peter was a Galilean. He was a fisherman. He was a blue-collar, sustenance kind of guy. He got dirty, he got his fingernails dirty. He was not an educated man. He was a working man. We know that Peter was married. We know that because one of Jesus' early miracles is to heal his mother-in-law. He is among the first disciples. He and his brother are fishing along the lakeside, and Jesus comes to them and says, "Come, follow me. I will make you fishers of men." And they leave everything to follow Jesus. Peter is part of that core that spends 3 years with Jesus. For 3 years, Peter is a part of all of that inner working. He's there for the teaching. He's there for the miracles. He watches all that unfold. Doesn't always get what's happening, I would say. Most of the time doesn't understand what's happening, but he is in the midst of all that. Peter is one of them that goes up on the mountain for the transfiguration. Peter is the one whom Jesus reprimands and says, "Get behind me, Satan." Peter is a witness to the resurrection. Now, as we understand Peter and as we spend time with Peter this morning, one of the other traits about Peter that we simply must know is his impetuous nature. It got him into trouble a lot. Got him into trouble during the transfiguration, because after the transfiguration happens and there's been this holy moment, Peter, who always needs to throw something in, says, "Let's build buildings." Or the day that Jesus says, "I need to go to Jerusalem and there I'm going to be killed," Peter says, "No, that's a bad idea." And that's when Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." On the night that Jesus is handed over, he's sitting at the meal with his disciples, and he says to them, "Tonight I'm going to be betrayed, and tonight I'm going to be denied by all y'all." And of course our friend Peter rushes right in. "Not me. Not me, Jesus. I won't betray you. Even if I need to die with you, I will not betray you." And in a matter of hours, Peter is warming himself over a fire. And they're saying, "Aren't you one of them?" I think you're one of those guys. I swear I'm not. Aren't you one? Not me. And the rooster crows. And Peter knows he's failed, and Jesus knows he has failed. In the New Testament, there are two books. One says 1 Peter, one says 2 Peter. Not really agreed upon whether Peter authored them. Peter is an uneducated Galilean. The Greek that those books are written is a little high. Could have been a scribe, or it could have been someone who had followed under Peter. To Peter are given the keys of the kingdom. And really that means two things. First of all, a position of authority. And part of that authority, most of that authority, ends up being shared with the Jews. That is the people group to whom Peter does almost the entirety of his ministry. There we have Peter, uneducated, fisherman, knew Jesus firsthand, interacted with Jesus firsthand, denied Jesus firsthand. Now we have Paul. I have to tell you, Paul couldn't be much more opposite of Peter. Paul is a Roman citizen from Tarshish. Now, what it means to be a Roman citizen is you have all sorts of privileges. And in fact, you have rights and privileges that extend to not being beaten and such. Those things serve Paul and don't serve Paul at different intervals. Paul is a Hebrew. He is also a Jew, but he is a Pharisee, which means he is an educated Jew. He is a strict Jew. Paul has all kinds of pride around this. He will say, I am a Jew among Jews. I've followed all the rules. I know what the rules are, and I have carried them out. By trade, he was a tent maker or a leather worker. He is a wealthy man. He is an educated man. He spends much of his life in Jerusalem. So whereas Peter is a country boy, Paul is from the city. He knows that life. Paul is introduced to us in the Bible as a persecutor of the people who followed Jesus. He's tracking down followers of the way. He is there at the stoning of Stephen. Paul meets Jesus post-resurrection. It's in a vision, it's in a revelation that Jesus comes to Paul, knocks him off a horse in the middle of the road, says, why are you persecuting me? He's rendered blind for 3 days. They lead him off to a house. Another Christian is sent to heal him, and the Christian says, are you sure you want me to heal this guy? He's really been a pain. He is healed. Paul talks about a thorn in the flesh. We don't know what that is. Some scholars guess malaria, others guess migraines, others still guess epilepsy. We don't know. What we know is there was this thing that was a real problem for him, and he asked God to remove this thing, and the answer was no. He lived with the thing, whatever it was. Peter is sent to the Jews. Paul's ministry unfolds almost exclusively with the Gentiles. And 1/4 of the New Testament is attributed to Paul. Whether it was all by Paul's hand or disciples of Paul, once again, all these years later, it's really hard to know. The man had huge influence. Now, these two men are very different, but there are parts of their stories that are very similar. The first one, each man was renamed. Peter begins as Simon, and it's Jesus who says to him, now you are Peter, you are the rock on which I will build my church. And Paul, prior to his conversion, when he is hunting down Jews, he is known as Saul. Both men in their transformation, become renamed. Both have sin that is transformed. For Paul, it is the sin of I've got it under control, I'm doing it myself, and I'm going to hunt down Jews or hunt down Christians and clean up God's church for God. Much of Peter's sin is around his impetuousness, his jumping in without doing due diligence, without waiting. Both men have weakness that is transformed, made strong in Christ. Both end up being profoundly bold witnesses. They're imitators of Christ. They call their followers to be imitators of Christ. Both perform miracles. Both end up being persecuted and imprisoned for the sake of the message. Both have provincial protection. In the story that we heard today about Peter being broken out of jail, 4 sets of guards. There's a guard on either side, double chains, walking past guards. God providing that provincial protection. Both of them escape death at some point along the ministry. Ultimately, both are martyred for following Christ. And quite honestly, folks, these two men struggled mightily with each other. It's a tough thing when one man believes that because the church, the followers of the way, came from the Jewish faith, that certainly people must be Jews before they can be followers of the way. They must be circumcised and follow the food rules and the purity rules. And even though Peter is given a vision, it is still a hard sell for him to move away from that. And on the other hand, we have Paul, who's going out and inviting in the dogs, also known as Gentiles, into the faith. They struggled mightily as they built that early church. So, Peter, Paul, the apostles. I hope at some point in your brain you're saying, that was just a lovely history lesson, but why? Why are we talking about these guys today? What is the point that we would have a feast day about Peter and Paul? Because aren't we really here about Jesus? Good question. I'm glad you asked it. Today isn't about Peter and Paul. This feast day is about a God who uses the likes of men like Peter and Paul to build Christ's church. Both men have failings and shortcomings and all kinds of stuff, and yet God worked mightily through each of them in different directions. From Paul, this man who had been so taught, he was an incredible thinker, and he knew how to study, and he knew how to do theology. And folks, that's where our church gets our theology from. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're the stories of Jesus. They are not the theology of Christ. Working through this Pharisee, God gives to us the very scriptures that help us to somehow move closer into relationship. It's reading Paul that Martin Luther has his conversion. It's the book of Romans on which our understanding of saved by grace through faith for works stands. Please understand how mightily that early church hated St. Paul. He'd been hunting them down, and he was always suspect. Was he just acting like a Christian so he could get in the middle of things and then arrest the entire church? And not only that, he kept bringing in those outsiders. It is only through the work of the heretics of the early church that his writings were preserved for us. And Peter, Oh, the gift that Peter gives us. That a man who can fly off the handle is a man that God can use mightily. The night in which Jesus was betrayed, Peter swears, I would never, ever deny you. And he does 3 times. And today, the gospel reading we have is the first time Peter is coming face to face with the beloved teacher, Jesus, that he had betrayed. Now, I want you to go back to your childhood for a minute and think about that time when you really messed up. And mom and dad have finally got home. And you know that you are due a trip to the woodshed. That's what today is. Peter denied Jesus. Jesus knows it. Peter knows it. And this is the first time, post-resurrection, that Jesus comes face to face with Peter. And Peter knows what he deserves. And what does he get? Do you love me? You're forgiven. Do you love me? He's reconciled. Do you love me? His call is reinstated. Peter and Paul are our reminders that God uses crooked wood to build his church. Certainly in the first century, but still now. We are crooked wood. And God has a place and a use and a value in each one of us. So this day, in the music, in the prayers, in the Eucharist, listen carefully. Do you love me? You are forgiven. Do you love me? You have been reconciled through the life, death, and resurrection of Christ. Do you love me? You have a call. The work is done. The last piece of the puzzle is the response. To follow. Amen.
Well, this light of mine